The moment they pulled Victoria Chen's access badge from her neck, Sergeant Major Dillard laughed, not a quiet laugh, a loud, deliberate one, the kind designed to carry across a room so everyone could hear exactly what he thought of her. "Support staff doesn't belong in operational briefings," he said, dropping her badge on the floor instead of handing it back. "Go clean something." If you've never seen this story, subscribe to our channel right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The badge hit the concrete floor of the briefing room with a sound so small it should have been nothing. A plastic card, a laminated photo, a string of numbers that said officially that Victoria Chen was authorized to be in this building, in this hallway, in this room. Sergeant Major Gerald Dillard didn't pick it up. He didn't look at it again. He turned back to the tactical map on the wall and resumed talking as if she had already ceased to exist, as if the act of dropping her credentials on the floor had been sufficient to erase her from the space entirely. Victoria bent down and picked it up herself. She did not say anything. She clipped the badge back onto her uniform, turned around, and walked out of the room. The door closed behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss, and through the narrow window set into the steel frame, she could see the backs of 12 men who had already forgotten she was ever there. She had been working at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. In that time, she had learned the names of every man on SEAL Team 5. She knew which operators favored right-eye dominance and compensated poorly in crosswind conditions above 15 knots. She knew who arrived early and who arrived late, who cleaned their weapons obsessively, and who treated maintenance as an afterthought. She knew the subtle lean in Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb's shooting stance that told her his right shoulder had been surgically repaired and never fully recovered. She knew that Lieutenant Commander Ryan Steele Patterson always paused for exactly 3 seconds before issuing a command, not from uncertainty, but from a habit of calculation so deeply ingrained it had become involuntary. She knew all of this because her job required her to be present and invisible at the same time. Her official title was Range Maintenance Specialist Grade GS6. Her duties included resetting steel targets after training, sequences, collecting and cataloging spent brass, repairing target frames, maintaining scoring systems, and performing general upkeep of the 3 long-range rifle ranges that SEAL Team 5 used for qualification and combat marksmanship training. She worked the 0500 shift, which meant she was already on the range when the operators arrived, and she was still there when most of them left. She was, in every functional sense of the word, part of the furniture. Sergeant Major Gerald Dillard had made that clear on her first week. He had come to the range that morning not to train, but to inspect, or so he claimed, and he had stood in the middle of the range and pointed at a collection of spent brass near the 3rd firing line and said loudly enough for 2 junior enlisted men nearby to hear, "This is why we can't have civilians in sensitive spaces. No attention to detail." Victoria had been the one who cleaned that brass. She had sorted it by caliber. She had placed it in the collection bins in exactly the sequence specified by base protocol. The brass he was pointing at had been left there 20 minutes earlier by a shooter who had overrun her lane and apparently didn't consider cleanup part of his responsibilities. She had not corrected Dillard. She had nodded, said, "Yes, Sergeant Major," and gone back to work. He had looked mildly disappointed that she hadn't argued. That was the first time she understood the nature of the game being played. Dillard was not a man who disliked her specifically. He was a man who had spent 27 years in a culture that categorized people efficiently and permanently, and Victoria did not fit into any category he found useful. She was not a SEAL. She was not command staff. She was not a secretary or an analyst or a contractor with a clearly defined technical function. She was a maintenance worker, which in Dillard's taxonomy meant she existed somewhere between the vending machines and the cleaning robots necessary in a logistical sense, invisible in every human sense. The problem was that Victoria was not invisible inside her own mind. She had grown up in a house where silence was a form of intelligence. Her grandfather, Colonel Henry Chen, retired Special Forces 2 combat tours in Vietnam, 1 in Grenada, and an additional 18 months in a classified advisory role that the family had stopped asking about before Victoria was born, had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 7 years old. He had raised her the only way he knew how, with discipline, with rigor, and with an absolute refusal to let sentiment become a substitute for competence. Her grandfather had been a sniper, not a hobbyist, not a competition shooter, a man who had spent years learning how to make death precise and purposeful, how to calculate variables that most people couldn't perceive, how to wait in conditions that would break ordinary patience, and how to act in the moment without the luxury of second guessing. He had taught Victoria everything, not because he intended to turn her into a weapon. He had taught her because it was the only real language he knew, and teaching her was the only way he understood how to love her. By the time Victoria was 12, she could estimate wind drift at 500 meters by watching the movement of grass. By 14, she could field strip and reassemble a Remington 700 blindfolded in under 3 minutes. By 16, she was shooting groups that her grandfather's old Special Forces colleagues, men who came to visit and ended up spending afternoons at the improvised range behind the farmhouse, described with the phrases like, "That's not normal," and "Where did she train?" As if the answer couldn't possibly be a retired old man in a wheat field in Central California. Her grandfather had never called her a prodigy. He had called her disciplined, which coming from him was the highest compliment in the language. "Anyone can be talented," he told her once when she was 17 and had just put 5 rounds through a single ragged hole at 800 meters and was waiting quietly for some acknowledgement that what she had done was extraordinary. Talented people are everywhere. They peak early and plateau and spend the rest of their lives explaining why they used to be better. Disciplined people improve every year, every decade, right up until they can't anymore. He had died when she was 22. Cancer, not combat, which struck her as deeply unfair. And then she had corrected herself because fairness was not a category her grandfather had ever found useful. She had spent 3 years after his death applying to military programs and being rejected for reasons that were never fully explained. She was told she was overqualified for enlisted roles and underqualified without a degree for officer tracks. She was told that her skill set, while impressive, didn't map to current personnel needs. She was told once by a recruiter who clearly thought he was being helpful that civilian marksmanship, however accomplished, wasn't quite the same as combat-proven performance. She had not argued. She had thanked him for his time and driven home in silence. The GS-6 position at Coronado had come through a federal employment portal. Range maintenance. Not glamorous. Not what she had imagined. But it put her inside the wire, inside the operational culture, and within daily proximity of the people and systems that she had spent her entire adult life trying to reach. She had told herself it was a starting point. 2 years and 3 months later, she was still telling herself that. The morning that Dillard dropped her badge on the floor, she had been at Coronado for 804 days. She had not fired a single round in that time, not on base, not off base. She had watched thousands of rounds fired by operators whose technique she could diagnose like a physician reading an X-ray, and she had said nothing because nothing she said would be received as useful. She walked back to the range that morning and picked up her broom and went back to work. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb was running a qual course on Range 2. He was one of the few men at Coronado who had ever spoken to her like a person rather than a piece of infrastructure. He had a dry humor and a habit of stating obvious things with theatrical gravity as if ordinary observations deserved to be delivered with the weight of revelation. He stopped at the edge of the lane when he saw her face and tilted his head slightly. "Dillard," he said. "Yes," she said. "What did he do this time?" "Drop my badge on the floor." Webb was quiet for a moment. He had a way of going quiet that was different from other people's silence. It had a quality of actual thought in it, as if the pause meant something was being genuinely processed rather than simply delayed. "You know what his problem is?" Webb said finally. "I have several theories. He's afraid of things he can't categorize. You don't fit in any box he knows how to use. That makes him nervous. Nervous people act small." Victoria looked at him. "That's either the most generous interpretation I've ever heard, or you're trying to make me feel better." "Both," Webb said and went back to his qual course. She spent the rest of the morning resetting targets on Range 3 after a particularly aggressive close-quarters sequence that had left 4 steel plates bent at angles inconsistent with their mounting brackets. She worked methodically, measuring plate alignment with a small bubble level she carried in her jacket pocket, adjusting tension on the mounting hardware with a torque wrench calibrated to spec. The work required attention and patience and a tolerance for repetition, none of which she found difficult. At 0940, Commander Patterson arrived on Range 3 with a small group, 2 men she recognized as visiting instructors from the Naval Special Warfare Command training cell and a young lieutenant she had not seen before. Patterson moved through the range with the quiet authority of a man who had been in charge of things for long enough that authority no longer required any active performance. He did not raise his voice. He did not posture. He simply spoke, and the people around him organized themselves accordingly. He had never spoken to Victoria directly. In 804 days, he had nodded at her twice, once when she had moved a target frame out of his path without being asked, once when he had come to collect a weapon from the armory adjacent to range 1, and she had been the only other person present. Both times the nod had been the kind of acknowledgement you give to a motion sensor that opens a door, correctly recognition of function, not of personhood. She was repositioning a target frame on the far end of range 3 when she heard Patterson's voice carry across the range. He was explaining a wind reading to the young lieutenant, and she stopped moving without making a decision to stop, because what he was describing was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not recklessly wrong, but wrong in a specific, subtle way that would cost a shooter at that range 4 to 6 inches of horizontal drift. At the distances they would be working, enough to matter in a real engagement. Not enough that most people in that situation would identify the error rather than blaming the shot. She stood with the target frame in her hands and said nothing. Patterson continued explaining. The lieutenant nodded with the focused expression of someone trying very hard to memorize information they didn't fully understand yet. Victoria set the target frame down. She picked up her wrench. She went back to work. At 1100, the visiting instructors ran a time sequence on range 2. She could hear the shots from where she was working, controlled pairs, smooth rhythm. Very good. These were serious operators. She found herself automatically calculating their average split times from the sound intervals, an involuntary habit she had never been able to fully suppress. At 11:45, she took her lunch break in the small concrete block room adjacent to the range that functioned as a break area for support staff. There was a folding table, 4 mismatched chairs, a microwave that ran hot, and a bulletin board covered in safety notices, and a single faded photograph of Ronald Reagan shaking hands with a man in dress whites. She ate her sandwich and read a monograph on applied ballistics she had borrowed from the base library, a technical paper published by the Army Marksmanship Unit on environmental compensation techniques for precision rifle engagements above 1,000 meters. She had read it before. She read it again because rereading was part of how she maintained information rather than simply accumulating it. Specialist Amy Torres, who handled administrative support for the range section, came in at 11:50 and poured herself coffee and sat across from Victoria and said, "You look like someone kicked your lunch." "I had a morning," Victoria said. "Dillard. Is it that obvious?" Torres wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at Victoria with the frank sympathy of someone who had worked around difficult men long enough to have developed a clinical understanding of their behavior. "He does this to everyone he can't control. The fact that he keeps coming back to you specifically means you're actually getting to him." "I'm not trying to get to him. That's why it's working." Victoria looked at her. "That doesn't make me feel better." "It's not supposed to make you feel better. It's supposed to help you understand the situation." Torres stood up and refilled her mug. "You're not invisible, Victoria. You're just in a place where the people with the most power to see you have the least interest in looking. That's not the same thing." Victoria thought about that for a while after Torres left. She went back to range 3 at 1300. The afternoon block belonged to a different training cycle. Close quarters battle, no long-range work. So her primary task was to prep range 1 for a 0600 qualification sequence, scheduled for the following morning. She started at the far end, working her way back toward the firing line, checking every target, every mounting bracket, every scoring mechanism. At 1420, she found the problem. The hydraulic actuator on target 7, the moving target system on the center lane, had a seal failure. Small leak, not yet catastrophic, but the actuator pressure was low enough that the target would stall during movement sequences, which would invalidate the scoring data for anyone running the qual. She pulled out her maintenance log and documented the failure, then went to the equipment shed to get the replacement seal kit. The seal kit wasn't where it was supposed to be. She searched the shed systematically, working through the shelving in order, not rushing, because rushing didn't make things appear faster. The seal kit was not on the designated shelf. It was not on the adjacent shelf. It was not in the overflow bin or the secondary storage cabinet. She went to the range office and looked up the inventory log on the terminal. The seal kit had been signed out 6 weeks ago by a technician named Rodrigo Fuentes, who apparently had not returned it. Fuentes was no longer assigned to Coronado. He had transferred to Naval Station Norfolk in March. She stood in the range office for a moment doing the logistics calculation. The 0600 qual was 16 hours away. The nearest authorized supply point with the correct part was a 40-minute drive. If she submitted a standard requisition, the part would be delivered in 48 to 72 hours. If she drove and picked it up herself, she could have it back and installed by 1800 tonight, give the hydraulic system an overnight pressure test, and the target would be operational for the morning qual. She did not have authorization to use a government vehicle for parts runs. She would have to drive her own car and submit a mileage reimbursement request that would take 6 weeks to process and might be rejected anyway. She called Fuentes at Norfolk. He didn't answer. She left a message. She called the supply point and verified they had the part in stock. She filled out the paperwork for a same-day personal vehicle parts, run-signed it, put it in Dillard's inbox, and drove her 2011 Honda Accord to the supply point in San Diego. The parts clerk at the supply point was a young petty officer named Garcia who looked at her GS6 badge and then at the requisition form and said, "You're not an operator." "No," she said. "I maintain the ranges they train on." "This part is for a moving target system." "Yes." "That's a pretty specialized part." "Yeah," she said again. "Do you have it in stock?" He checked his computer. "Yeah, we have it." "Then I'd like to check it out, please." He looked at her for another moment with the expression of a person who suspected something was slightly irregular but couldn't identify exactly what. Then he processed the checkout. She was back at Coronado by 16:30. She installed the seal, rebuilt the actuator pressure, and ran a 20-minute movement test on target 7. The system performed flawlessly. She updated the maintenance log, cleaned her tools, and was off the range by 18:30. She found out at 06:30 the next morning, when she came in to do final range prep for the qual, that Dillard had pulled target 7 from the qual sequence anyway. He had seen the maintenance flag in the log, decided the system was unreliable without knowing that she had already repaired it, and restructured the qual to use only targets 1 through 6. She did not say anything. She reset the targets for the adjusted sequence. At 700, Patterson arrived for the qual with 12 operators. He walked the range before the event started checking target positions. He stopped at the 7 position, the empty position, and looked at it, and then looked at his range brief and frowned slightly. He turned to find whoever was responsible for range setup. His gaze moved past 2 junior enlisted men and stopped briefly on Victoria. "You," he said. "Sir?" "What happened to 7? "Sergeant Major Dillard pulled it from the sequence, sir. There was a hydraulic issue yesterday. I repaired it last night, but he'd already modified the qual plan." Patterson looked at her steadily for a moment. "Is 7 operational?" "Yes, sir. I ran a full pressure test yesterday evening. It's at spec." He looked at the modified qual plan in his hand. He looked at target 7's position. He was calculating something. She could see it in the 3-second pause, the same pause she had noticed over 800 days of watching him think. "Reinstate 7, he said. "We're running the original sequence." She reinstated 7. The qual ran without any issues. She watched from her position near the equipment shed, tracking the operator's performance with the automatic attention of someone who couldn't stop themselves from doing analysis. The young lieutenant she had seen the day before ran the sequence once at a level that suggested training nerves, once at a level that suggested he had identified the source of his error and corrected it. When the qual was over and the operators were breaking down their equipment, Patterson walked toward the equipment shed to drop off a clipboard. He passed within 8 feet of her. He did not nod. He did not acknowledge her. But he did pause for exactly 1 beat, just long enough that she registered it and registered that he had registered something, and then he continued walking. She did not know what that meant. She went back to range 3 and finished her afternoon prep and thought about what her grandfather had told her the last summer before he got sick, when they had been sitting on the back porch of the farmhouse, watching light change over the hills in a way that made everything look briefly important. "The world has a limited number of mechanisms for recognizing what it hasn't seen before," he had said in the slow, deliberate way he spoke when he was not being practical but something else. "Most of those mechanisms only activate under pressure. Under comfort, people see what they expect to see. Under pressure, they see what's actually there." She had asked him what kind of pressure he meant. He had looked at the hills for a long time. The kind, he said, that doesn't leave you a choice. She had not fully understood it then. She understood it now in a theoretical way, understood that the moment she was waiting for the moment, the world would be forced to look at her without the protective filter of its own assumptions, would have to come from somewhere it couldn't be managed or anticipated. She was not impatient about it. Patience was not a virtue she had cultivated. It was a condition she had been trained into, the way muscles are trained into a particular movement until the movement becomes structural, not chosen each time but available. At 1700, she signed out of the range, drove home to her apartment in Coronado, made dinner, and read for 2 hours. She ran 4 miles at 2000, returned, showered, and was in bed by 2200. She was back on the range at 04:55 the next morning, 5 minutes before her shift officially started, because arriving exactly on time felt like arriving late. She was restacking the brass collection bins when her radio crackled with what she initially processed as a malfunction. A burst of fragmented transmission voices layered over each other, the specific acoustic signature of people trying to communicate through a suddenly overloaded channel. She straightened up and listened. The transmission cleared for 2 seconds, long enough for a single coherent fragment to come through, someone's voice pitched, with the controlled intensity of a person reporting something they had hoped they would never have to report. She heard 2 words clearly before the channel collapsed back into noise. Hostile contact. She stood completely still for a moment, the way her grandfather had taught her to go still when something required real attention, not frozen, not paralyzed, but concentrated, every available resource brought to bear on the information at hand. Then from the western perimeter of the base, she heard the first mortar round impact. It was not close, but it was close enough that she could feel the concussion in her chest, a deep, low-pressure wave that arrived half a second after the sound, like a second heartbeat. She set down the brass collection bin. She did not run. She moved. The second mortar round hit closer than the first. Victoria felt it before she heard it, that same deep concussive pressure against her sternum, but sharper this time, more directional, accompanied by the distinct high-pitched secondary sound of shrapnel cutting through metal somewhere to the northwest. The brass collection bin was still in her hand. She set it down on the ground, not dropping it, not throwing it, setting it down with the same deliberate economy of motion her grandfather had drilled into her since she was 9 years old. Panic was noise. Noise cost time. Time in the next few minutes was going to be the only currency that mattered. Her radio crackled again. The channel was fractured, multiple transmissions colliding, but she could extract fragments if she focused. She heard Patterson's voice, unmistakable, that particular cadence of controlled command issuing a rally point. She heard Webb responding, and then a third voice she didn't immediately recognize, cutting over both of them with a damage report that made her stomach tighten. 2 operators down on the eastern training corridor. 1 casualty confirmed at the vehicle staging area. The phrase multiple shooter positions came through twice before the channel dissolved into static again. She was already moving toward the range armory. The armory was a reinforced structure adjacent to Range 1, not the main base weapons vault, but the range-specific storage facility that held training weapons, ammunition stocks, and the support equipment used during live-fire sequences. She had a maintenance key. It was part of her GS6 access package, a functional necessity, because range maintenance sometimes required access to weapon storage for cleaning and inspection purposes. Dillard had tried to have her access revoked twice. Both times, the range officer had overruled him on operational grounds. She reached the armory door and used the key. The lock opened on the first try. Inside, she moved with the systematic efficiency of someone who had spent 2 years cataloging every item in this room. She knew where everything was without having to look. The weapons were racked by class pistols, carbines, designated marksman rifles, precision rifles. She moved past the carbine rack without slowing. She moved past the DMR section. She stopped at the precision rifle storage. There were 3 Mark 11 Mod 0 sniper rifles in the rack. Semi-automatic, 7.62 NATO 10-round magazine capacity. Effective range out to 1,000 meters with a quality optic. She had cleaned these rifles dozens of times. She had inspected their trigger groups, their gas systems, their barrel crowns. She knew every one of them the way a surgeon knows instruments, not by memory, but by contact, by the accumulated tactile knowledge of repeated careful handling. She took the middle rifle. It had the best barrel condition of the 3. She checked the chamber clear. She grabbed 2 magazines from the ammunition locker, verified they were loaded, and seated one. She found the spare optics case on the top shelf and pulled out the Schmidt and Bender scope she had cleaned just 8 days ago, still in its protective sleeve. She heard the third mortar round hit while she was mounting the scope. This one was close enough to rattle the armory's steel door on its frame. She tightened the scope ring, set 0 at the turret, and walked out of the armory. The base had transformed. That was the only word for it, not changed, not disrupted, but fundamentally transformed the way a place becomes something else entirely when the rules that defined it stop applying. She could hear automatic weapons fire now coming from at least 2 distinct directions. She could hear men shouting, the specific kind of shouting that was communication under duress. Not panic, though the line between those two things was narrower than most people knew. She could hear vehicle engines. She could hear the percussion of a larger weapon, something crew served somewhere on the northern perimeter. She had already identified the observation tower on the eastern edge of the range complex as her primary position. It was a simple structure, 40 feet open platform, railing ladder access. It had been built for range safety observation and was rarely used because modern range operations use camera systems. But it had something the camera systems didn't have: direct sight lines to the high ground positions on the base's eastern and southeastern perimeter, which was based on the direction of fire. She was hearing exactly where the enemy shooters had established themselves. She was moving toward the tower base when she heard Patterson. "Stop." His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of a command that expected to be obeyed before it finished being spoken. She stopped. She turned around. Patterson was 12 meters away, moving toward her from the direction of the Range 2 firing line. He had a carbine up. He was not pointing it at her. It was index muzzle discipline intact, but his eyes were on her and on the Mark 11 in her hands, and his expression was doing several things at once that she didn't have time to fully catalog. Behind him, she could see Webb and 2 other operators taking covered positions along the range berm. "Put the weapon down," Patterson said. "Sir," she said, "I need to get to the observation tower. You are a GS-6 civilian employee. You are going to put that weapon down and move to the designated shelter location, which is The designated shelter location is in the direct line of sight of at least one confirmed shooter position on the southeastern perimeter," she said. "I identified the shot pattern from the 3rd mortar impact. They have the northeast quadrant of this base calculated. The shelter is not safe." Patterson stopped moving. He was close enough now that she could see his face clearly. The 3-second pause was happening, but compressed, accelerated by the pressure of the situation into something closer to 1 second. "Who are you?" he said. It was not what she had expected him to say. "Victoria Chen," she said. "Range maintenance, sir." "Chen." He said her name like he was hearing it for the first time, which he probably was. "How do you know where their shooter positions are?" "Shot sequence mortar spacing in the direction of the automatic weapons fire I've been tracking for the last 4 minutes. They've got elevated positions, at least 2, possibly 3, on the ridgeline running east-southeast. They're controlling fields of fire toward the operational center of the base. Your people are pinned because anyone moving in the open is being engaged from above." Webb had come up beside Patterson. He looked at Victoria, then at the Mark 11 in her hands, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but recognition, as if a piece of information he had held in a general undefined way had suddenly become specific. "She knows what she's talking about," Webb said quietly. Marcus Patterson said a single word with the weight of a full question in it. "Commander, I've watched her on this range for 2 years. I'm telling you, she knows what she's talking about." Patterson looked at Victoria for a long moment. Another mortar round impacted further away this time, but the automatic weapons fire intensified immediately, after which told her the mortar was being used to reposition and redirect rather than destroy. These attackers were coordinated. They were not operating on improvised instinct. Someone had planned this sequence. "You think you can make shots from that tower?" Patterson said. "Not think," she said. "I can tell you the distances: 600 to the first ridgeline position, 750 to the second. If there's a third, it'll be at approximately 900 slightly left of the primary axis." Webb said under his breath, "Commander." Patterson looked at the tower. He looked at the field of fire available from that elevation. She watched him do the geometry, an experienced tactical mind, applying the same spatial reasoning she had just applied, arriving at the same conclusion from a different direction. "If you're wrong," he said, "you die up there." "If I'm right," she said, "your people stop dying down here." The pause this time was not 3 seconds. It was less than 1. "Go," he said. She went. The ladder was steel pipe cold, and she climbed it without rushing, because rushing on a ladder with a rifle and 2 magazines required a level of physical coordination that introduced error, and error at this point was not acceptable. She counted the rungs automatically, 22 rungs to the platform, and when she came over the top rail and established herself on the observation deck, the first thing she did was not look for targets. The first thing she did was breathe. 3 slow, controlled breaths. Her grandfather's ritual. Not for relaxation, for calibration. Every instrument requires calibration before use. A sniper's instrument is her own nervous system, and a nervous system under adrenaline without calibration is a precision tool being used as a hammer. She settled into a prone position on the platform, rifle up, and began her observation. The ridgeline was immediately apparent. She had been right about the distance, 600 meters to the near edge, possibly slightly more. She was scanning with the Schmidt and Bender, working from left to right, looking not for people, but for the things people left behind when they thought they were hidden. Movement, heat shimmer inconsistency, the subtle geometry of a weapon barrel against a natural background. She found the first position in under 30 seconds. The shooter had done a competent concealment job, but he had chosen a position that put a distinctive rock formation at his 9 o'clock, and the barrel of his weapon indexed toward the base created a horizontal line against the irregular vertical texture of the rocks, a line that didn't belong, and that her eye had been trained to find since she was 11 years old. She dialed the range correction, set the windage. She had been tracking the wind since she arrived at work that morning, a low-level habit, and the current condition was a steady 7-knot crosswind from the southwest. She made the adjustment without looking at the turret markings because she didn't need to look. She put the reticle on the barrel line. She exhaled halfway. Let the respiratory pause come naturally. Did not force it. She pressed the trigger. The Mark 11 fired. The recoil pushed through her shoulder, familiar, expected, incorporated without disruption. She stayed with the scope through the shot. The barrel line disappeared. She was already moving to the second position. Down below on the range complex, she heard a change in the pattern of movement. The quality of shouting altered, not louder but more purposeful, which meant Patterson's people had registered that something was different and were beginning to act on it. She could not afford to track that with more than peripheral attention. Her job was the ridgeline. The second position was harder. The shooter had chosen better ground, a natural depression with overhead concealment, and he had been disciplined enough not to present his weapon until he was ready to fire. She found him not by the weapon but by his hands. One brief movement, both hands adjusting position, and the shift in shadow that the movement created against the ground behind him. 750 meters. The wind was consistent. She trusted her earlier read. She held the correction and found the position again and waited for the moment when he would have to present to take his next shot. He presented. She fired. She did not watch the result. She was already finding the third position. This was the one she was less certain about. The 900-meter estimate had been inferenced from pattern. The 2 confirmed positions had established a spacing logic, and a third position following that logic would fall at approximately 900 meters left of the primary axis. But inference was not observation, and she was not going to fire at inference. She found him by his mistake. He fired a 3-round burst from a position she had not yet identified. In the muzzle signature, a brief low thermal flash visible through the optic for less than half a second marked him as precisely as if he had sent her a message with his location attached. 880 meters, slightly left of her estimate, marginally upslope from the terrain feature she had been watching. She adjusted. She waited for his next firing sequence. He gave it to her 11 seconds later. She pressed the trigger between his second and third rounds on the pause created by his own recoil management. After that, the ridgeline was quiet. She did not move immediately. She stayed in position scanning because confirming the absence of threat required the same diligence as identifying the threat in the first place. Her grandfather had drilled this into her. The most dangerous moment is not when you find the enemy. It is when you think you have found all of them. She scanned for 90 seconds. Nothing presented. Below, the character of the fight had changed again. The automatic weapons fire from the northern perimeter was still active, but the southeastern positions were silent, and the silence was having a cascading effect. She could hear Patterson's voice, now clear and authoritative, directing his operators into movement that the enemy's fire suppression had previously made impossible. The base was beginning to take back its own space. She stayed on the platform. At some point, she estimated 8 minutes after her third shot. Though time had a different quality in this state, Webb's voice came from below the tower. "Chen, clear up here," she said. "Can you see the crew-served weapon on the northern fence line?" She shifted position, realigning her field of view northward. The crew-served weapon she had identified it earlier by sound as a medium machine gun, likely a PKM based on its firing signature, was positioned in a way that had been extremely effective against the base's main movement corridors. She scanned the northern tree line. "I see it," she said. "What's your read?" 1,500 meters. "Beyond my effective range with this rifle in these conditions." A pause. "Honest answer," Webb said. "I don't miss because I'm honest about what I can't do." Another pause. "We have a Barrett in the main armory," Webb said. "If I get it to you—" "Get it to me," she said. It took 4 minutes for Webb to reach the main armory, retrieve the M107, and get back to the base of the tower, 4 minutes during which she maintained her scan of the ridgeline and the northern tree line and tracked the PKM's firing pattern with the kind of cold clinical attention that her grandfather had once described as the mind becoming a machine temporarily in service of something that requires a machine. She heard Webb on the ladder. He came over the top rail with the Barrett across his back and his face carrying an expression that she could not immediately categorize. He set the weapon down beside her and then sat back against the railing and looked at her for a moment. "You've done this before," he said. "Not in combat," she said. "It doesn't look like it's the first time." "It's the first time," she said, "but I've been preparing for it since I was 7 years old." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your grandfather?" She looked at him. "I've seen you read ballistics papers on your lunch break," he said. "I've seen you clock split times from the sound of shots. I've seen you correct target alignment errors that our qualified range officers missed. I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place and you weren't causing problems." He paused. "What's your grandfather's name?" "Henry Chen," she said. "Colonel retired, Special Forces." Webb went very still. "Henry Chen," he said again slowly with a different quality in his voice. "The Henry Chen from the AMU reports in the A80s. He wrote 3 of them," she said. Webb looked at the Barrett in front of her and then at the ridgeline and then back at her, and his expression completed whatever journey it had been on. "Okay," he said. "Okay." She shouldered the M107. 1,500 meters was at the edge of what she had consistently practiced, not beyond her, at the edge. The Barrett was a .50 MG. The bullet's weight and velocity profile made it substantially more forgiving of range estimation error than the Mark 11's 7.62, but it also required a different trigger technique, a different management of the longer lock time, a different understanding of the relationship between eye relief and mirage effect at extended range. She found the PKM position. She identified the shooter and the assistant gunners, 2 people working in coordination, which told her something about the organization behind this attack. This was not improvised. This was practiced. She did not hurry. The wind had shifted slightly in the last 10 minutes, not dramatically, but enough to matter at this distance. She read it from 3 reference points: a flag on the base perimeter, the movement of scrub vegetation at the mid-range point, and the subtle drift pattern in her own scope image caused by atmospheric refraction. She built the correction in her head, confirmed it twice, and applied it to her hold. She pressed the trigger. The Barrett's recoil was different from the Mark 11, heavier, slower in its push, a longer duration of force that required a different kind of absorption. She managed it and stayed with the scope. The PKM went silent. Not immediately, there was a brief continuation of fire reflexive, the gunner's trigger finger, completing the motion already in progress, and then silence. The northern tree line was quiet. Webb beside her exhaled slowly through his nose. 2, he said, counting only the Barrett shots. Then after a moment, 3 targets with the Mark 11. 2 confirmed, she said. 3rd was suppressed. 3 positions neutralized. She did not respond to that. She was still scanning, still working, because the job was not complete until the scan was complete. Below, she heard Patterson's voice cut through the radio channel. "Clear now." The interference gone, issuing a command that indicated his operators had regained movement freedom and were taking the fight to what remained of the attacking force. The base was not secured, but the tactical balance had shifted in a way that would not reverse. She stayed on the platform. At some point, Webb said quietly, How long have you been waiting for something like this? She thought about the question with the same seriousness she applied to everything. 805 days, she said. He looked at her. Since I started here, she clarified. He nodded slowly. He looked out at the ridgeline, the quiet ridgeline, the positions she had found, and addressed the ground that was no longer working against the people she had been invisible among for more than 2 years. Victoria, he said, and she noticed that he used her first name, which he had done perhaps twice before in 805 days. Patterson is going to want to talk to you. I know, she said. Dillard is also going to want to talk to you. I know that too. Those are going to be very different conversations. Yes, she said. She kept scanning. The fourth mortar round, if it came, never came. The firing from the northern perimeter diminished over the next several minutes, fell to sporadic bursts, and then stopped entirely. The radio traffic resolved from crisis communication into tactical coordination, which was the acoustic signature of a battle transitioning from reaction to resolution. She registered all of it with the part of her mind that was not occupied with the scope and the ridgeline and the careful, patient work of making sure there was nothing left on that high ground that was going to hurt any of the people below her. When she was satisfied, not when she felt good, not when she felt relieved, but when her objective assessment told her the scan was complete, she lowered the Barrett. She sat up on the platform and looked at her hands. They were steady. That too was her grandfather's gift, not that he had trained fear out of her, because he had told her repeatedly that training fear out of a person was both impossible and inadvisable. That fear was information, that the goal was not to eliminate it, but to prevent it from outrunning your competence. Her hands were steady because her competence had not been outrun. She heard the ladder again. Patterson came over the top rail and stood on the platform and looked at her and the 2 rifles and the empty ridgeline, and he did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "How many shots?" "4, she said. 3 with the Mark 11-1 with the Barrett. He looked at the ridgeline, then back at her. 4 shots, he said. "Yes, sir." He sat down on the platform railing, which she had never seen him do, had never seen him use furniture in any informal way, and he looked at her with an expression she had no prior data to interpret because she had never seen it on his face before. "I've been at this base for 3 years, he said. "I walk past your range every single morning." "Yes, sir." "I didn't know your name until 40 minutes ago." She did not say anything to that because there was nothing useful to say. "That's on me," he said, not defensively, not with any performance of guilt, just stating a fact the way a tactician acknowledges an error in order to correct for it. She looked at him and thought about 805 days, and all the mornings she had arrived at 0455, and all the targets she had reset, and all the brass she had collected, and all the ballistics papers she had read at the folding table in the break room, and all the conversations she had not been included in, and all the names that had been said around her and over her and through her as if she were not a person but a piece of landscape. "It's all right, sir," she said. "It's not," yeah, he said. She accepted that. Below them on the base that was slowly, painfully reassembling itself into something operational, she could hear voices, some she recognized, some she didn't. She could hear equipment moving. She could hear the specific cadence of men who had been through something serious and were beginning to process what came next. Patterson stood up. He looked at her one more time. "Can you stay on this platform until I give you a stand down?" "Yes, sir." "I'll send someone with water." "Thank you, sir." He went back down the ladder. She turned back to the ridgeline, picked up the Schmidt and Bender, and continued her scan. Someone sent water up at the 40-minute mark. It was the young lieutenant, the one she had watched run the qual course twice the morning before, the one who had corrected his error on the second attempt. He came up the ladder with 2 bottles of water and a protein bar, and the specific expression of a person who had been given a task and was uncertain whether the task was adequate to the situation, but was going to execute it properly regardless. He set both bottles on the platform railing without speaking. Then he looked at the 2 rifles in the ridgeline and back at her, and he said, "Lieutenant Aaron Cole, I was on range 2 when it started." "Victoria Chen," she said. "I know who you are," he said. "Everyone down there knows who you are right now." She opened one of the water bottles and drank half of it in a measured way, not gulping, because gulping told her body that the crisis was over, and her body didn't get to decide that yet. "How many casualties?" she asked. Cole's face shifted. 3 confirmed KIA, 7 wounded, 2 critical. He paused. One of the wounded is Sergeant Harker. He was on the eastern corridor when the second mortar hit. She knew Harker. Not well, she knew most of them. Not well, but well enough. He had a habit of leaving his brass in a pattern that told her he shot slightly cross-dominant and compensated by torquing his grip in a way that was going to give him problems at extended range eventually. She had noticed it and said nothing because that was not her place. "He's going to make it," she asked. "They think so," Cole said. "Shrapnel, arm and shoulder. He'll need surgery." She nodded. Cole looked like he wanted to say something else. She waited. "The 3KIA," he said finally. "I knew two of them, Petty Officers Ramirez and Donnelly. They were in my training cohort." He stopped. "The third was a contractor, logistics." She did not offer comfort because comfort was not what the moment required, and Cole was not looking for it. He was looking for a place to put the information somewhere outside himself where it could be held at a distance that made the next hour survivable. "I'm sorry," she said. Simple, direct. Her grandfather's version of comfort, not elaborate, not performed, just the acknowledgement that the loss was real and that she registered its weight. Cole nodded once and went back down the ladder. She drank the rest of the first water bottle and went back to her scan. At the 90-minute mark, Patterson came back up the ladder. He was not alone this time. There was a man behind him she did not recognize, older senior, bearing the kind of face that had been responsible for large decisions for a long time and wore the evidence of it in the set of his jaw and the specific quality of his eyes. He was in utilities, but she couldn't immediately read his rank from the abbreviated insignia. Patterson said, "Stand down. The perimeter is secured." She lowered the Barrett and sat up. Her back had developed a deep ache across the lumbar region from the sustained prone position. She had been aware of it for the past 30 minutes and had been ignoring it with the practiced discipline of someone who understood the difference between pain as signal and pain as distraction. The man behind Patterson looked at her and then at the rifles and then at the ridgeline in a sequence that told her he was assembling an understanding of what had happened up here. "This is Rear Admiral Thomas Graves," Patterson said. "Naval Special Warfare Command." She did not stand up, her position made standing immediately impractical, so she acknowledged him from where she was. "Sir." Graves looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of a person who is updating a model they didn't know they had built incorrectly. "Commander Patterson tells me you made 4 shots from this position." Graves said, "Yes, sir." 4 shots, 3 confirmed hostile neutralized, 1 crew-served weapon position suppressed. "Yes, sir. The PKM position, I couldn't confirm the result at 1,500 meters with the optic available, but the weapon went silent and hasn't resumed." "It won't," Graves said. "We've confirmed the result." He paused. "Where did you train?" She told him about her grandfather. She kept it brief and name background. The farmhouse, the range behind it, the years of work. She did not editorialize. She stated facts in the order they were relevant. Graves listened without interrupting, which she noted as meaningful. Senior officers who listened without interrupting were either very confident or very interested, sometimes both. When she finished, he said, "Henry Chen." "Yes, sir." "I know that name," Graves said. "I know it from a precision engagement record set at Fort Benning in 1987 that still hasn't been officially broken. I know it from 3 Army Marksmanship Unit technical papers that I made my junior officers read 10 years ago." He paused again. "You're his granddaughter." "Yes, sir." Graves looked at Patterson. Patterson looked at Graves. Something passed between them. Not words, not even an expression exactly, but the particular compressed communication of 2 people who have worked at the same level of responsibility long enough that they can conduct a significant portion of a conversation in the absence of language. Then Graves looked back at her. "How long have you been at Coronado?" he said. 805 days, sir. "As a range maintenance specialist?" "Yes, sir." He said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, in a way that was not directed at her, but was not precisely private either, 805 days. She did not respond to that. She waited. "Come down off this tower," Graves said. "I need you in the debrief." Patterson helped her get the Barrett down the ladder, not because she needed help, but because the Barrett was awkward to manage on a ladder, and 2 sets of hands made it faster, and speed was still a value right now. When they reached the ground, she noticed 3 things in rapid sequence. The first was that there were more people in the range complex than there had been before additional personnel, some in different uniform configurations, some in civilian clothing that carried the specific quality of federal law enforcement or intelligence presence. The second was that every person who saw her shifted their attention toward her in a way that had nothing to do with the maintenance role she had occupied for 805 days. The third was that Dillard was standing near the Range 1 equipment shed, and he saw her at the same moment she saw him. His face did something complicated. She had expected anger. Anger was the emotion she had the most data on from Dillard. It was the emotion he reached for reflexively when the world presented him with something he couldn't categorize. But what his face did was not quite anger. It was something more disorganized than that. Something that anger was one component of alongside something else she couldn't immediately name. She filed it and kept moving. The debrief was held in the Range 1 operations room, a space she had been in dozens of times to access maintenance logs and submit equipment requests, but which now contained 8 people who looked at her when she entered as if she had materialized from somewhere they hadn't expected. Patterson sat at the head of the table. Graves sat to his right. Webb was present, which she was glad of. Cole was there. 3 people she didn't know, 2 in the federal presence clothing, 1 in Navy uniform with intelligence insignia. She sat in the chair Patterson indicated. The intelligence officer spoke first. His name was Commander Reston, and he had the precise information-dense speech pattern of someone whose professional life consisted entirely of synthesizing complex data into accessible conclusions. The attack was coordinated, Reston said. We're still developing the full picture, but the preliminary assessment is that this was a targeted operation against SEAL Team 5 specifically, not the base generally. The mortar placement, the elevated shooter positions, the timing, relative to your operational schedule. This was planned against a specific target set. Patterson said, who? Reston said, we have a working theory. We're not prepared to state it with confidence yet. Then state it without confidence, Patterson said. Reston looked at him. An adversarial intelligence network has had unusual interest in SEAL Team 5's training schedule for approximately 6 months. We flagged it. We assessed the probability of a direct action attack as low based on historical precedent and the difficulty of conducting an operation of this scale inside CONUS. He paused. We assessed incorrectly. Webb said 6 months. You have known for 6 months that someone was watching us. We knew someone was gathering information. We did not know, could not confirm without additional indicators that the information gathering was in service of a direct action plan. The room was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of people absorbing the gap between what was known and what should have been done with what was known. Patterson said to Victoria, walk us through your shot sequence, everything. She did. She walked them through the initial position, identification, the ballistic corrections, the wind rate, the shot timing. She was precise and unembellished. She included the uncertainty on the third Mark 11 position, how it had been partly inferred from pattern rather than directly observed, and the moment the muzzle signature had confirmed her inference. She included the shift to the Barrett and the specific reasoning behind the whole correction at 1,500 meters. When she finished, no one spoke for a moment. Then the intelligence officer said carefully, Ms. Chen, the third position you engaged, the one you identified by muzzle signature. Can you describe the target's behavior in the moments before you fired? She thought back. He fired a 3-round burst. I read it as a controlled burst, not panic fire. The spacing between rounds was consistent. He was managing recoil deliberately. After the burst, there was an 11-second pause before his next firing sequence. 11 seconds, Reston said, approximately. Reston and the unknown federal presence man exchanged a look. The look had a specific quality, the quality of people who have just received a piece of information that they needed and weren't sure they were going to get. That pause is consistent with a trained operator changing magazines, Reston said. Yes, she said. That position, Reston said, was not occupied by a standard gunman. We believe it was occupied by the team's designated marksman, the individual responsible for directing fire and adjusting targeting. He paused. Eliminating that position was the single most consequential shot taken in this engagement, more so than the PKM suppression. Patterson was looking at her. Webb was looking at the table. She said, I didn't know that at the time. No, Reston said, but you identified the position correctly, assessed it accurately, and executed at the moment of maximum vulnerability. He looked at Graves. This was not luck. Graves said to no one in particular, no, it was not. The debrief continued for another 40 minutes. She answered every question fully and without embellishment. She corrected two small errors in the preliminary engagement report that Reston's team had drafted from the physical evidence errors of geometry in both cases where the team had misread the shot angles and drawn incorrect conclusions about firing positions. Both corrections were accepted without resistance, which told her something about the quality of the people in the room. When it was over, people began to stand and move. Graves stopped beside her. "Where are you on the federal employment track?" he said. "She a GS6, sir?" "I know your current grade. I'm asking where you want to be." She looked at him. "I want to serve, sir. I've been trying to find the way in for 3 years." Graves nodded slowly. "I'm going to make some calls." She did not allow herself to feel anything about that statement while she was still in this room. Feeling things about statements came later when the situation had stabilized and she had the cognitive space to evaluate what she actually felt. Right now, the situation had not stabilized. "Thank you, sir," she said. She walked out of the operations room and into the corridor, and the first thing she encountered was Dillard. He was waiting. She understood immediately that he had positioned himself in this corridor deliberately, that whatever complicated thing his face had done when he saw her coming off the tower, he had spent the duration of the debrief deciding what he was going to do with it. She stopped. She waited. Dillard said, "I want to be clear about something." "All right," she said. "What you did out there." He stopped. Started again. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working against his own instincts, which she had observed twice before in smaller contexts. "That was outside your authorized role. You took a weapon from the armory without direct authorization. You accessed a restricted facility using maintenance credentials for a purpose those credentials were not issued for." "Yes, Sergeant Major," she said. "Those are serious violations of base protocol." "Yes, Sergeant Major." He looked at her. She looked back. "If you had missed," he said, "I would be recommending your termination and possible federal charges." "I understand, Sergeant Major." Another silence. The corridor was not empty. People moved past them, some glancing at the interaction, most too occupied with the operational aftermath to give it sustained attention. "You didn't miss," Dillard said. She waited. He said nothing else for a long moment. His face was still doing the complicated thing. She had a better name for the second component of it now. It wasn't quite shame. Dillard was not a man who accessed shame easily. That much was clear from 805 days of observation. But it was something adjacent to shame, the particular discomfort of a person who has acted on a certainty that has been publicly and comprehensively disproven. "Sergeant Major," she said, not because she was going to apologize, but because the silence had reached the point where a word from her was the only thing that was going to resolve it. "I'm not asking you to change your assessment of my role here. I know what my job is. I've done my job every day I've been here." "I know that," he said, and something in the way he said it told her that this was difficult for him, in a way that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the realization that he had constructed an understanding of this base that was missing an entire person. "Then we're all right," she said. He looked at her for one more moment. "Chen," he said, "Sergeant Major. The badge thing." He stopped. "That was..." He stopped again. She waited. He did not finish the sentence. He gave her one short nod and walked away. She stood in the corridor for a moment after he left, processing what had just happened with the same systematic attention she applied to everything. Dillard was not going to become her advocate. He was not going to transform into someone who understood her or championed her or saw the years of invisible work she had brought to this base. But he had come closer than she had expected to, saying something honest, and that was more than she had thought he was capable of. She filed it appropriately and kept moving. Webb found her near the range exit at the end of the afternoon. The base was still in a state of controlled recovery. Security teams on the perimeter, medical personnel, cycling through the particular organized noise of an institution, reassembling itself after a trauma it had not anticipated and could not fully absorb in a single day. He fell into step beside her and matched her pace, which was something he did naturally. She had noticed before that Webb calibrated his movement to whoever he was walking with a small social intelligence that most people deployed unconsciously. "Graves made calls," Webb said. "Already." He was on his phone before the debrief was over. During the last 20 minutes when Reston was going through the forensic sequence. Webb paused. I don't know who he was talking to, but Patterson knows, and Patterson's face looked like it does when something significant is happening. She thought about that. Webb, she said. Yeah. The three who didn't make it. Ramirez, Donnelly, and Mitch Carver, the contractor. I know that Ramirez ran the 0600 qual last week. He ran it clean. Webb was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he did. He was the best young operator in the team. She said nothing. She did not try to make that smaller than it was. They walked in silence for a while. Then Webb said, You know what's going to happen now? I have a theory. Graves doesn't make calls like that for GS6 maintenance workers, Webb said. He makes calls like that for assets, for people he wants inside a program. I know, she said. How do you feel about that? She thought about 805 days. She thought about 0455 arrivals and brass collection bins and the bubble level in her jacket pocket. She thought about her grandfather's farmhouse and the wheat field and the range behind it and the years before Coronado of being told she was overqualified and underqualified and that her skill set didn't map to current personnel needs. She thought about the observation tower and the 4 shots and the 3-second pause on Patterson's face when she had told him what she could see and what she could do, and he had believed her. I feel, she said carefully, like the preparation was not wasted. Webb looked at her sideways. That's the most measured response to your entire life is about to change that I've ever heard, he said. My grandfather didn't raise me to emote about outcomes, she said. He raised me to perform when the moment required it and to evaluate results honestly afterward. And your evaluation? She considered it seriously the way she considered everything. 4 shots, she said. 3 confirmed, 1 suppressed, under combat conditions, against trained operators. She paused. The preparation was adequate. Webb stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him. His expression for the first time in 805 days was completely unguarded. No dry humor, no tactical neutrality, just the face of a man who was looking at someone he had seen every day for over 2 years and was only now fully seeing. Victoria, he said, Henry Chen's granddaughter. Yes, she said. He'd be proud, Webb said. I know I never met the man, but from everything I know about him. He stopped. He'd be proud. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved through her that she did not have an immediate word for. Not grief, not joy, but something that occupied the territory between them. Something that had to do with the gap between the person her grandfather had made her and the 805 days during which no one had seen that person clearly. Thank you, she said quietly. They walked back into the operational area, and behind them the ridgeline sat quiet in the late afternoon, and the 4 positions she had found and addressed held their silence with the permanence of things that had been resolved and would not come back. Inside the operations building, Patterson was standing at the window. He saw her come in. He did not look away. She met his eyes across the room. He nodded once, not the functional nod of a man acknowledging infrastructure, but the deliberate weighted nod of one professional recognizing another, and turned back to his work. She sat down at the maintenance log terminal. She had 4 target frames that needed inspection reports filed before end of day. The attack had damaged 2 of the steel plates on range 2. The hydraulic system on target 7, the one she had repaired the night before, the one Dillard had pulled from the qual, and Patterson had reinstated, had taken minor shrapnel damage to its housing and would need a secondary assessment. She opened the maintenance log. She began to type. Outside the base continued its recovery, and somewhere in it, Rear Admiral Graves was on his phone, and the conversation he was having would reach her before morning in a form she had spent her entire adult life preparing for and had stopped letting herself expect. She typed her maintenance report. She was thorough. She was precise. She did not rush. The maintenance report took her 40 minutes to complete. She filed it at 1847, logged out of the terminal, collected her jacket from the hook beside the door, and walked to her car. She sat in the parking lot for a while without starting the engine. This was not something she did often. Victoria Chen was not a person who sat still without purpose. Stillness, for her, had always been a tool, a deliberate state that served a function, not a place she drifted into. But tonight she sat in the dark of the parking lot with her hands in her lap and let herself be still in the other way, the way that had no function except to acknowledge that something had happened that required acknowledgement. 3 men were dead. Ramirez, Donnelly, Mitch Carver, the logistics contractor she had seen once or twice near the vehicle staging area, and whose name she had not known until Lieutenant Cole said it in the debrief. 7 people were in medical care. 2 of them were critical and might still become the 4th and 5th names on that list before morning. She had fired 4 shots and prevented the list from being longer. She held both of those truths at the same time the way her grandfather had taught her, not collapsing them into each other, not letting one cancel the other out, but holding them side by side and accepting that both were real and that reality did not owe her a clean resolution between them. She started the engine and drove home. At 03:42, her phone rang. She was awake. She had slept for approximately 2 hours, which was more than she had expected, and had been lying in the dark since 0300, running the engagement sequence through her mind. Not in the catastrophizing way, not looking for errors or second-guessing decisions, but in the analytical way, extracting data, assessing what she had learned, filing it as experience rather than trauma. Her grandfather had taught her that debriefing yourself was as important as any external debrief. The only observer of your own internal state is you, he had said, and if you don't debrief that observer honestly, you lose access to the most important data set available. She picked up the phone on the first ring. Chen. It was Patterson. His voice carried the particular quality of a man who had not slept either, but whose wakefulness had been productive rather than restive. Sir, I need you on base at 0500, not the range. The main administration building, conference room C. Yes, sir. Graves will be there, a legal officer from JAG, and 2 people from Naval Special Warfare Command Personnel Division. He paused. Do you have a lawyer? The question landed in a way she had not anticipated. Should I? I'm going to tell you something as a statement of my personal assessment, not as a formal legal advisement, Patterson said. What happened today is going to move in 2 directions simultaneously. The first direction is the one you'd expect: recognition, documentation, the process that follows when a civilian employee performs an act of valor in a military context. The second direction is the one people don't talk about openly: institutional review of the circumstances that put you in a position to perform that act without being formally authorized to do so. You mean the question of how I access the armory? I mean the question of why a person with your capability and background was working as a GS-6 maintenance specialist for over 2 years without any of the appropriate officials having the relevant information to make a different decision. He paused again. Those are related questions, but they come from different places and they go to different people, and you need to understand the difference before you walk into that room. She processed this. She recognized an act of significant professional risk on Patterson's part, giving her this information, this framing the night before a formal meeting that he would be party to. He was not obligated to do it. He had done it anyway. Commander, she said, yeah. Why are you telling me this? The silence on the line lasted long enough that she thought the connection might have dropped. Then he said, because I walked past your range every morning for 3 years and I didn't know your name. And because the right way to correct a mistake is not to wait for someone else to do it. She said, I'll be there at 0500. One more thing, he said. Sir, do you have the monograph, the AMU paper your grandfather wrote, the 1987 one on environmental compensation at extended range? She was briefly surprised. I have a copy, yes. Bring it, Patterson said. Graves asked for it specifically. She arrived at the administration building at 0450. Conference room C was at the end of a corridor she had passed perhaps a dozen times in maintenance-related errands, always moving through without stopping, always someone with a destination that was somewhere else. She stopped outside the door and stood for a moment. Her grandfather's voice from a memory she couldn't precisely date. She was perhaps 15, and they had been on the range at the farmhouse, and he had said something she had not fully understood until much later. The hardest position to shoot from is not the difficult one. It is the one where you know you are right and you must remain quiet until the moment allows you to prove it. Some people cannot hold that position. They either speak too soon and are dismissed, or they hold so long they begin to doubt themselves. The discipline is in the holding, knowing what you know, neither displaying it prematurely nor surrendering it to silence. She opened the door and walked in. Graves was already there. Patterson was there. A woman in Navy legal officer insignia, JAG, as Patterson had said, sat to the left of the table with a laptop open and a legal pad beside it. Two people from NSWC personnel, both in civilian clothes, both with the compact professional manner of people whose work consisted of fitting unusual people into unusual roles. And Reston, the intelligence officer from the debrief, who she had not expected. She sat in the chair that was clearly set for her across from Graves, which placed her at the functional center of the table. Graves said without preamble, "Victoria Chen, let's begin." What followed was 3 hours of the most sustained, intensive professional scrutiny she had ever experienced. The JAG officer commander Priya Holloway walked her through the legal framework governing civilian employee conduct during base security incidents, the specific regulations covering unauthorized access to weapons, storage, and the distinction between emergency exception provisions and willful protocol violation. Victoria answered every question directly and completely. She did not minimize what she had done, and she did not apologize for it, and she did not frame it as anything other than what it was: a decision made in real time under real conditions with the information available. At the 90-minute mark, Holloway closed her legal pad and said to Graves, "My assessment is that the emergency exception provision under SEC and SAVINST 5500.29 applies fully. There is no viable disciplinary action." Graves nodded once as if this confirmed something he had already known. One of the NSWC personnel officers, a trim, precise woman named Erickson, who had not spoken yet, leaned forward and said, "Ms. Chen, I want to ask you some questions about your background. Not the incident, your training history, your qualification record, your previous attempts to enter military service." Victoria told her. The same story she had told Graves on the tower, but more complete. Now the federal employment applications, the rejection letters, the recruiter who had told her civilian marksmanship wasn't quite the same as combat-proven performance. The 3 years between her grandfather's death and the GS-6 position at Coronado. When she finished, Erickson said, "You were rejected from the Marine Corps Scout Sniper program in 2019. "Yes." "On what grounds?" "I was told that the program was not accepting civilian track candidates at that time, and that my application didn't meet the enlisted service requirement." "That's not what the rejection letter said." Victoria looked at her steadily. "No, it wasn't. The letter cited physical profile concerns." Erickson paused. "You have no physical profile flags in any medical record we can locate. You passed the standard federal employment physical for the GS-6 position without any notation." "Yes." "So the physical profile rejection was inaccurate," Victoria said. The word was flat and precise, the way her grandfather had taught her to state facts, not with anger attached to them, because anger was noise, but with the clarity that made noise unnecessary. Erickson wrote something on her pad. Graves and Reston exchanged a look. Reston said, "Ms. Chen, I want to revisit something from yesterday's debrief." She looked at him. "The attack on SEAL Team 5 was a targeted operation," Reston said. "We've confirmed the working theory from yesterday. We have an identified adversarial network. What I'm about to tell you is classified at the secret level, and you will need to sign a standard non-disclosure agreement before I continue." He paused. "Are you willing?" She looked at Graves, then at Patterson. Both of them were watching her without expression. "Yes," she said. Holloway produced the NDA form. Victoria signed it. Holloway witnessed it. Reston said, "The network that targeted SEAL Team 5 has been operating inside the continental United States for approximately 18 months. They have assets inside the federal employment system." "Not many, but enough." He paused. "The physical profile rejection on your Marine Corps application in 2019. We have reason to believe it was not administrative error." The room was quiet. Victoria sat with that information for a moment, held it the way she held things that required real processing, feeling its full weight before she allowed herself to begin analyzing it. "You're saying someone deliberately blocked my application," she said. "We're saying we have reason to investigate that possibility," Reston said carefully. "Why would an adversarial network have any interest in blocking my application to a sniper program 3 years before the attack on this base? Because Henry Chen's granddaughter entering a combat marksmanship program was a variable someone may have wanted to eliminate," Reston said. "We don't know the full scope yet. We're still building the picture." Patterson said quietly from his end of the table, Someone knew who you were, and they didn't want you in a position to do what you did yesterday. The implications of that unwound in her mind with a slow, cold precision that she recognized as the feeling of encountering a problem significantly larger than the one she had originally understood herself to be inside. She had come to Coronado 2 years and 3 months ago, believing she was working around institutional inertia, the ordinary impersonal friction of a system that didn't know how to place her. The possibility that the friction had not been entirely impersonal was a different kind of problem. The GS6 position, she said. Did they? We don't know, Reston said. It may have been a failure of the blocking mechanism someone intended to prevent that posting from reaching you, and it didn't work. Or the posting was allowed to go through because a maintenance role at a training base was assessed as low impact. He paused. Obviously, that assessment was incorrect. Erickson said, Ms. Chen, regardless of how you arrived at this point, you are at this point. And the reason we're all in this room is because Rear Admiral Graves has a proposal. She looked at Graves. Graves said, I want to commission you. The word commission landed with the weight of everything she had wanted and stopped letting herself want. He continued, direct commission into the United States Navy as an ensign with immediate assignment to a Naval Special Warfare Command advanced training pipeline. We have a specific program, small, not widely known, focused on precision engagement capability and intelligence integration for special operations support. You would be the first non-prior service direct commission candidate in the program's history. He paused. The legal framework exists. Commander Holloway has confirmed it. The question is whether you want it. She looked at him. She thought about all the things she could say, about 805 days, about the badge on the floor, about the brass collection bins and the bubble level and the ballistics monographs she had read at the folding table in the break room, about Ramirez running the qual clean, about the 3-second pause and the tower and 4 shots in the dark while the base bled around her. She thought about her grandfather, the specific weight of his hand on her shoulder, the first time she had shot a group through a single hole at 300 meters, and the way he had not said anything for a long moment and then had said only again. She said yes. Graves nodded. No drama, just the clean acknowledgement of a decision correctly made. Patterson made a sound that was not quite a word, something short and involuntary. The sound of someone who has been holding tension against an uncertain outcome and just felt the tension release. What followed was 4 more hours of formal process medical clearance, documentation, background review, certification. The standard officer candidate interviews conducted in compressed form because 3 of the people in the room had the authority to compress them, and a preliminary security clearance interview with Reston that covered her background, her contacts, her international travel, and 4 specific questions about her grandfather's classified advisory work that she answered honestly and completely with the information she had, which was limited. At 11:30, she signed the preliminary commission papers. At 11:45, Holloway shook her hand across the table and said, Welcome to the Navy, Ensign Chen. The word ensign was strange in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not bad strange, but the particular strangeness of a thing you have wanted for so long that the word itself has become abstract, a concept more than a designation. And hearing it applied to you requires a brief recalibration of what you understand yourself to be. She walked out of conference room C into the corridor, and the first person she encountered was Webb. He was standing in the corridor with a paper cup of coffee in each hand and an expression that told her he had been waiting there since approximately 0800. He held 1 cup out to her. She took it. Well, he said. Ensign Chen, she said. Webb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Ensign Chen. Yes. He raised his cup. She raised hers. They drank in silence, which was the correct way to acknowledge it, and then Webb said, Your grandfather's AMU paper. Graves asked you to bring it. He did. He kept it after the meeting. He's going to put it in the program curriculum, Webb said. I would bet money on it. She thought about that. Henry Chen's work in circulation again, in a program that was about to have his granddaughter in it. There was something that wanted to be felt about that, something warm and complicated that she set aside for later when she had space to feel it correctly. Cole found her in the afternoon near the range. She had gone back to do a final inspection of the Target 7 hydraulic repair because her maintenance responsibilities didn't end until her commission was formally executed, and she was not the kind of person who left work unfinished because circumstances had changed. Cole said, "They're saying you've been commissioned." "Preliminary papers," she said. "Formal ceremony in 30 days." He was quiet for a moment. He looked younger than he had the day before, not in his face, which was the same, but in his bearing, as if the events of the past 24 hours had stripped away a layer of performance and left something more honest underneath. "Ramirez's family was notified this morning," he said. "Yes." "Donnelly's too. He had a daughter, 8 months old." She looked at him. "I keep thinking," Cole said, "that if the PKM had stayed operational another 4 minutes, if you hadn't taken that shot, more of us would be on that list." He paused. "I keep thinking that, and then I think about Donnelly's daughter, and I don't know what to do with both of those things at once." "You hold them," she said, "side by side. You don't try to resolve them into something simpler than they are. You just hold them." He looked at her. "Does that get easier?" "My grandfather never told me it gets easier," she said. "He told me you get more capable of holding things that are heavy. That's not the same." Cole nodded slowly. He seemed to be considering that with genuine seriousness, which she appreciated. "Ensign Chen," he said, trying the word. "It's still Chen for another 30 days, she said, "and right now I need to finish this target inspection." He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She went back to the Target 7 housing. The shrapnel damage was superficial, a scoring mark on the exterior plate, no penetration to the hydraulic components. She documented it in the maintenance log with the same precision she had applied to every report she had filed in 805 days. At 1600, Patterson found her on the range. He stood at the edge of the firing line while she finished the documentation, and when she looked up, he said, "Walk with me." They walked along the perimeter of Range 1, and for a while neither of them spoke, which was comfortable in a way that surprised her. She had not previously imagined that silence with Patterson would be comfortable because they had never shared enough space for comfort to develop. But something had shifted in the geometry of what she was to him and what he was to her, and the new geometry apparently included the capacity for shared silence. He said, "I want to tell you something." "All right." "When you told me at the tower in the middle of all of it that you could see the positions, that you knew the distances, I believed you." He paused. "I want you to know that wasn't entirely rational." "I know," she said. "I had almost no information about you. You were the range maintenance specialist." "That's it. I had your face, I had your body language, I had about 30 seconds of conversation." He paused again. "But something in the way you spoke. There was no performance in it, no attempt to convince me. You just stated what was true." He looked at her. "People who are bluffing always try to convince you. People who know what they're talking about just say it." She thought about her grandfather, about the years of being told to remove the performance from her speech, not to be flat, not to be cold, but to trust the content and stop decorating it. "My grandfather used to say that the loudest argument in any room is usually the weakest one," she said. Patterson was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like he was remarkable." "He was," she said simply. They walked a little further. "What Reston said this morning," Patterson said, "about the application. The possibility that someone interfered. Yes, that's going to be investigated properly. Graves has already directed Reston's team to open a formal inquiry." He paused. "If it's confirmed, if someone inside the federal system deliberately blocked you from positions you were qualified for, that's going to have serious consequences." "I know," she said. "Are you prepared for that process?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm prepared for the possibility that the investigation finds something. I'm also prepared for the possibility that it finds nothing definitive, and the answer is that the system just failed in the ordinary way systems fail." She paused. "Either outcome is survivable. What wasn't survivable was staying invisible." Patterson stopped walking. She stopped too. He said, "I've been in the Navy for 19 years. I've done 3 combat deployments. I've commanded one of the best special operations units in the world." He looked at her steadily. "And yesterday, the most important tactical decision I made was letting a maintenance worker climb a tower with a rifle I wasn't authorized to give her." "You made the right call," she said. "I did," he said, "but it took everything going wrong for me to be in a position where I could see it clearly." He paused. "That's not good enough." She held his gaze. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." He nodded, not defensively, not making it smaller, just accepting it the way a serious person accepts a serious truth. They walked back toward the operations building, and behind them, Range 1 sat in the late afternoon with its targets reset and its mechanisms repaired and its brass cleared ready for the next training cycle, as if the day before had never happened, except that it had, and everyone on this base knew it. And the woman who had maintained this range for 805 days was walking away from it towards something she had been prepared for since she was 7 years old and was only now finally being allowed to begin. The 30 days between the preliminary papers and the formal commission ceremony were the strangest 30 days of Victoria Chen's life, stranger in some ways than the attack itself, because the attack had required her to be fully present and fully operational, and there had been no space in it for the kind of disorientation that came from waiting for your life to change while still living the old version of it. She continued reporting to the range at 0455. She continued resetting targets and collecting brass and filing maintenance reports. No one had told her to stop, and she was not the kind of person who stopped doing her job because something was pending. The work was honest, and it needed doing, and she did it with the same precision she had always brought to it. But the range was different now. Not physically, the steel plates were where they had always been. The hydraulic systems operated on the same schedules, the brass accumulated in the same patterns relative to the same shooter tendencies. But the people on it were different toward her, and that difference changed the texture of every hour she spent there. Some of them she had never spoken to directly before. Operators who had spent 2 years treating her as part of the range infrastructure now stopped and introduced themselves formally with their names and their handshakes, as if meeting her for the first time was a thing they wanted to do correctly. She accepted every introduction without irony and without the particular brand of quiet satisfaction that would have been understandable, but would also have been small. And she was not interested in being small about it. On the 4th day, Harker came back to the range. He was in a sling, his arm and shoulder had required surgery, as Cole had said, and he was not yet cleared for physical training. But he walked onto range 2 in the mid-morning while she was checking target alignment and stood watching her work for a moment before he spoke. "They told me what you did from the tower," he said. She looked up. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone put shrapnel in my shoulder," he said, "which is accurate." He paused. "I heard you use the Mark 11 from the Wounded SEALs kit." "Yes. That was mine. I went down on the Eastern Corridor. They evac'd me before—" He stopped. "It was my kit you took." She looked at him steadily. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He was a man in his mid-30s with the particular physical quality of someone who had spent 15 years systematically making his body as capable as possible, and the sling disrupted that quality in a way that was clearly uncomfortable for him. Not just physically, but psychologically, the disruption of competence being as painful for people like Harker as the wound itself. "I want you to know something," he said, "and I want you to know I mean it without any qualification." "All right," she said. "That rifle," he said. "It went to exactly the right person." She held his gaze. Something in her chest did the thing she had been containing for 30 days, not releasing, just moving like a pressure system shifting. "Thank you," she said. "I'll make sure it gets properly cleaned before I'm off the range." He almost laughed. It was the surprise kind of almost laugh, the kind that comes from an unexpected angle. "Ensign Chen," he said, trying the title. "Not yet," she said. "Close enough," he said, and walked back toward the medical facility. On the 9th day, Reston called. She was in her apartment reading a new monograph, this one on atmospheric density compensation at altitude, which she had ordered specifically because the NSWC program Graves had described would involve high-altitude training environments she had not previously worked in. She picked up on the second ring. "We have preliminary findings on the application interference investigation," Reston said. He did not waste time on preamble, which she respected. "I want to give you a heads up before the formal briefing next week." "Go ahead," she said. "The physical profile rejection on your 2019 Marine Corps application was processed by a personnel clerk named David Sorensen, who was stationed at the recruiting command in San Diego at the time. Sorensen left federal employment in 2020. His last known address is in the Philippines. He has not been reachable through standard channels." Reston paused. "Sorensen's financial records show a deposit of $47,000 to an offshore account in the 2 weeks following the processing of your rejection." She set the monograph down. "Someone paid him to reject my application," she said. "That is the current investigative assessment, yes." She sat with that, the $47,000, her application. The recruiter who had told her civilian marksmanship wasn't quite the same as combat-proven performance. The GS-6 position that she had found through a federal employment portal and had taken because it was the only door that had opened. Was the GS-6 position also manipulated, she asked. We don't believe so. Our current assessment is that the blocking mechanism was designed to keep you out of combat-capable roles. Sniper programs, direct action, support positions, anything where your grandfather's training would have been directly applicable. A range maintenance posting was probably assessed as no threat. He paused, which tells you something about the quality of their analysis. It tells me they underestimated what range maintenance involves, she said. It tells me, Reston said, that they watched you for years from a distance and still couldn't see what was actually there. A pause, which is the same mistake everyone at Coronado made. The difference is that the network made the mistake with hostile intent and the Navy made it with bureaucratic indifference. She thought about whether that distinction mattered. Has Sorensen been located, she asked. Not yet. That's an ongoing process. Reston's voice had a specific quality, careful, measured, but with something underneath it. Ms. Chen, Ensign Chen, I want you to understand the full scope of what we're looking at. This network, the one that attacked SEAL Team 5, the one that may have interfered with your application, has been operating patiently. 18 months of intelligence gathering. 3 years of personnel manipulation if the Sorensen link holds. This is not improvised. He paused. And the attack on Coronado was not their last operation. We know this. What do you need from me? She said. Reston said, that's a conversation for after your commission is formal, but I wanted you thinking about it. She said, I've been thinking about it since the debrief. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. That's why I called you tonight instead of waiting for the briefing. She went back to the monograph after the call ended. She read for another 2 hours. She was not anxious. Anxiety required uncertainty about what you were going to do, and she had no uncertainty about that. She was something closer to focused, oriented, the way a compass doesn't tremble when it finds north. The formal commission ceremony was held on a Friday morning 31 days after the attack. It was small by design. Graves had offered her the option of a larger event, and she had declined. She wanted the people who mattered and the correct paperwork and nothing else. Graves administered the oath. Patterson stood to her left. Webb stood to her right, which was not a position with formal protocol attached to it. He was simply standing there because he had asked if he could, and she had said yes. Cole was present. Harker was present, still in the sling, standing straighter than the injury probably recommended. Erickson from NSWC personnel was there. Holloway, the JAG officer. Specialist Torres from Range Administration, who had come in civilian clothes on her day off and stood in the back of the room with an expression that Victoria noticed and filed carefully, because it was the expression of someone who had always known something was true and was experiencing the particular satisfaction of being confirmed. Dillard was not present. She had not expected him to be. Graves administered the oath in full without abbreviation. She repeated each phrase with the steadiness she brought to everything, not performing steadiness, not managing her voice for effect, but simply being steady because steadiness was what she was made of. When it was done, Graves shook her hand. Ensign Chen. Sir. Patterson shook her hand. He held it for a moment longer than a formal handshake required, not long enough to be awkward, but long enough to be deliberate. Your grandfather would have been here if he could, he said quietly. She had not expected him to say that. She had not prepared for it. For a single moment, something moved through her that was not manageable in the way she managed other things, a warmth and a grief and a completeness all at once, the feeling of a man she had loved beyond articulation, being present in a room he had never entered, in the outcome of a life he had built and had not lived to see delivered. Yes, she said, her voice was even. He would have. Webb, when he shook her hand, said only, Henry Chen's granddaughter. The same thing he had said on the tower. It meant the same thing it had meant then and more. Harker shook her hand with his good arm and said, Don't clean anything today. She said, I already filed this morning's maintenance report. He shook his head slowly. Of course you did. Torres hugged her, which was not something Victoria had anticipated, and which she accepted with the slight awkwardness of someone receiving physical warmth that they are genuinely moved by, but don't quite know how to process. Torres said, I always knew, and Victoria believed her, and the believing of it mattered. The reception afterward was brief coffee and pastries in the same break room where she had eaten her lunches for 805 days, where the microwave ran hot, and the photograph of Ronald Reagan shaking hands with the man in dress whites still hung slightly crooked on the wall. Someone had put a small arrangement of flowers on the folding table, and she looked at the flowers and thought that she had sat at this table approximately 800 times, and now she was standing at it as a commissioned officer of the United States Navy. And the table was the same table, and the room was the same room, and she was not the same person except that she was entirely. She was exactly the same person she had always been, the person her grandfather had made, and what had changed was not her, but the world's ability to see her. Patterson pulled her aside near the end of the reception. "Your assignment orders will come through within the week," he said. The NSWC program Graves described. "You'll be based initially at Pendleton for the pipeline, then assessed for assignment based on operational need." He paused. "Reston's team will be in contact about the network investigation. That's going to run parallel to your training." "I understand," she said. "There's one more thing," he said. "I've been asked to give a written statement for the inquiry into your 2019 application rejection, a formal assessment of your demonstrated capability relative to what you were rejected from." He looked at her. "I intend to say that you are the most capable precision marksman I have personally observed in 19 years of service. I intend to say it unequivocally and on the record." She looked at him. "Commander," she said, "I know I don't owe you an apology for the application rejection. I wasn't party to it. But I owe you one for 3 years of walking past your range without stopping." He said it without performance, just facts stated cleanly. "Consider this the beginning of that." She said, "Noted. Thank you." He nodded. That was sufficient for both of them. She left the reception at 1100 and drove home and sat in her apartment in the quiet, and for the first time in 30 days she allowed herself to simply be still, without purpose, not working, not analyzing, not preparing, just sitting with what had happened and what it meant and what came next, holding all of it in the way she had been taught to hold things without forcing a resolution between them, without making them simpler than they were. Her phone rang at 1340. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered. "Ensign Chen," a woman's voice efficient and direct. "This is Commander Diane Walsh, Naval Special Warfare Command. I'm the program director for the unit you'll be joining. I wanted to make contact before the formal orders come through." "Commander Walsh," she said. "I'll keep this brief," Walsh said. "I've read your engagement report from the Coronado incident. I've read your grandfather's AMU monograph. Graves sent it to me the morning after the attack. And I've read the preliminary findings on the application interference inquiry." A pause. "I want you to know what you're walking into." "Please," Victoria said. "The program is small, 8 operators currently. The work involves precision engagement support for special operations missions that require capabilities beyond standard military sniper qualification. The intelligence integration component is real. You'll be working closely with Reston's network, among others." Walsh paused. "The program has never had a direct commission candidate. Some of the people in it are going to have opinions about that." "I understand." "I want to know how you handle opinions," Walsh said. Victoria thought about Dillard, about 805 days of opinions expressed through drop badges and public dismissals, and the particular weight of being overlooked so consistently that the overlooking became a form of pressure. She thought about what she had done with that pressure. "I convert them into fuel," she said, "and I let the work answer." Walsh was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "is exactly what I needed to hear." Another pause. "There's one more thing. The network that attacked Coronado. Reston's team, they had developed a lead on a secondary operation they believe is in planning stages. When you complete the initial pipeline, you may be asked to support the intelligence effort directly, not in an analyst capacity." "In a marksman capacity," Victoria said. "Yes." She said, "I've been ready for that since before I knew what it was." Walsh said, "Report to Pendleton on Monday, 0600. "Yes, ma'am." The line went quiet. She set her phone down and looked at her apartment, the spare organized space of a person who had lived provisionally for years, who had not accumulated things because accumulation required a belief in permanence that she had not been able to fully sustain. The ballistics monographs on the shelf, the framed photograph of her grandfather on the wall. Not in uniform, just standing in the wheat field behind the farmhouse, squinting slightly into the light, holding a rifle with the casual ownership of a man for whom the object was as natural as his own hand. She had looked at that photograph every day for 3 years. She looked at it now with different eyes, not different in what they saw, but different in what they understood about what they were seeing. He had made her. Every choice he had made about how to raise her every hour on that range, every correction and standard and refusal to accept less than what she was capable of, all of it had been building towards something he had known was there, even when the world refused to confirm it. He had never expressed doubt about her. Not once, not in the way that needed words. She had understood that as a child. She understood it differently now. She stood up. She went to her desk. She pulled out a fresh legal pad. She kept legal pads because she thought better in handwriting, and at the top of the first page, she wrote 2 words and underlined them. What next? Not a question, a heading. She began to write. The first week at Pendleton hit her like a wall, and she hit it back. The program's pipeline was not designed for her specifically. It was designed for operators who already had years of military service and were being refined for a more specialized function, and the assumption embedded in every element of it was that the candidates had a baseline of institutional experience she did not technically possess. She was aware of this gap, and she addressed it the way she addressed every gap, by working harder than anyone else in the room and by asking precise questions when she needed information, and by never under any circumstances pretending to know something she didn't. There were 8 people in the program currently, as Walsh had said, 6 men, 2 women. The 2 women, a Marine gunnery sergeant named Reeves and a Navy intelligence officer named Park, found her in the dining facility on the second evening and sat across from her without asking, and looked at her with the frank, evaluative attention of people who had navigated a specific kind of institutional resistance for long enough that they could recognize it in someone else at a distance. Reeves said, "Direct commission." "Yes," Victoria said. "No prior service." "Correct." Reeves looked at Park. Park looked at Victoria. "You're going to get tested," Park said. "Not officially, but you're going to get tested." "I know," Victoria said. "How do you want us to handle it when it happens?" Reeves asked. Victoria looked at her. The question was asked in a way that presumed solidarity, not as an offer, but as a practical matter. 2 experienced operators calculating the tactical situation on behalf of someone new to the terrain. "The same way I'll handle it," she said, "by being better than the test." Reeves said, "Good answer." The testing came on the 4th day. It came from a man named Chief Warrant Officer Dale Prescott, 11 years in the program, the kind of institutional authority that derives not from rank, but from demonstrated excellence, accumulated over time, which was the most durable kind and also the most resistant to anything it hadn't personally certified. He was not hostile. He was something more precise than hostile. He was skeptical in a way that had been earned by years of watching people arrive with credentials that didn't translate to performance, and he had no particular interest in adjusting his skepticism for a civilian with a dramatic story. He set it up simply. A range qualification sequence at the end of the first week standard for all new arrivals, nothing modified for her benefit or to her disadvantage. 7 targets, varying distances from 400 to 900 meters, mixed conditions, 20-minute window. She completed it in 11 minutes. Clean. Every target, including the 900-meter steel at the back of the range, which Prescott later confirmed had been added specifically because the program's standard qualification sequence only went to 800, and he had added the extra target without announcement to see how she handled an unexpected variable. She had handled it by shooting it. Prescott stood at the scoring station for a long moment after she came off the line. He looked at the results. He looked at her. He looked at the results again. He said, "Your trigger technique is unusual." "My grandfather developed it for extended precision applications," she said. "It reduces involuntary pre-trigger movement by managing the respiratory pause differently than the standard technique." "It shouldn't work as well as it does," he said. "My grandfather's argument was that standard technique was optimized for military training pipelines rather than for the physics of the problem," she said. "He believed the physics should drive the technique, not the pipeline." Prescott was quiet for a moment. "Henry Chen," he said. "Yes." "I read his 1987 paper when I was in training," Prescott said. "I thought it was theoretical. Too far outside the standard model to be practical." She said nothing. I was wrong, he said. It was simple, undecorated. The statement of a man who corrected errors quickly because errors were expensive. She said, most people are. It takes seeing it perform to understand that the theory is actually applied physics. He looked at her steadily. Can you teach it? The question was not what she had expected. She had expected resistance or reluctant acceptance or the particular form of begrudging respect that still maintains its distance. She had not expected an immediate pivot to the question of transmission. Yes, she said. Then I have a request, Prescott said. Not an order, a request because you're not under my direct authority in this program. Go ahead. 3 of my people are working against a ceiling at extended range, he said. 700 to 900 meters, their consistency drops. I've been watching it for months. I think it's a technique problem at the trigger breath interface, but I haven't been able to isolate it. He paused. I'd like your eyes on it. She looked at him. Chief Warrant Officer Dale Prescott, 11 years in a classified precision engagement program, asking the Direct Commission, civilian with no prior service, to diagnose a technical problem he had been unable to solve. When she said, tomorrow morning, 0600. I'll be there, she said. She was there at 0550. What she found in those 3 operators confirmed Prescott's instinct. It was a technique problem at exactly the interface he had identified. The standard trigger technique they had been trained on compressed the respiratory pause in a way that introduced a micro-tremor at the critical moment, and the tremor was small enough to be invisible at shorter ranges, but accumulated into a meaningful error at 700 meters and beyond. Her grandfather's technique resolved it by relocating the pause in the breathing cycle, removing the source of the tremor rather than trying to compensate for it. She taught it over 2 mornings. By the 3rd morning, 2 of the 3 operators were shooting groups at 900 meters that they had not previously achieved. The 3rd one, a quiet Army Ranger named Castillo, who had the best natural instincts she had encountered in anyone not named Henry Chen, took a day longer but then surpassed the other 2. Prescott watched all of it without commenting until it was complete. Then he said to the group and to her, we're going to formalize this. I'm recommending it as a supplemental technique module for the program curriculum. He looked at Victoria when he said it. She thought about her grandfather's monograph sitting in Graves' hands on the morning after the attack. She thought about the AMU papers that Webb had mentioned, the 3 technical documents that had shaped precision engagement training for a generation and had been written by a man in a wheat field in Central California who nobody at Coronado had thought to mention to the maintenance worker they passed every morning. My grandfather would appreciate that, she said. On the last day of the initial pipeline, Walsh called her into her office. Walsh was a compact, direct woman who communicated with the efficient honesty of someone who had spent 20 years in an environment where dishonesty was operationally expensive. She had a quality Victoria recognized, the quality of a person who had also spent years being underestimated and had resolved that experience not into bitterness, but into a precise and permanent commitment to accurate assessment of everyone she encountered. Your pipeline results, Walsh said and slid a document across the desk. Victoria looked at it. The scores were annotated in Walsh's handwriting, not just numerical results, but observations, technical notes, the kind of detailed analysis that required genuine attention. You're the highest scoring first pipeline candidate in this program's history, Walsh said. Victoria looked at her steadily. The previous record was held by Prescott, Walsh said, 11 years ago. She paused. He knows. I told him before I called you in. What did he say? Victoria asked. Walsh almost smiled. He said, the physics should drive the technique, not the pipeline. Victoria said nothing, but something moved in her, something quiet and deep and certain. The feeling of a man who had died in a farmhouse in Central California, being present in a room he had never entered, speaking through the work he had built into her, still teaching through everything she had become. Walsh said, Reston's team has a development on the secondary network operation. They believe it will require direct action support within the next 60 days. You'll be briefed formally next week. She paused. Are you ready? Victoria thought about what ready meant. It didn't mean the absence of fear. Her grandfather had been clear about that. It didn't mean certainty about outcomes or the comfort of familiar ground or the assurance that the variables were manageable. It meant that your preparation was sufficient for the problem in front of you and that you had done the honest work of assessing both the preparation and the problem without inflating one or minimizing the other. She assessed. She had spent her entire life becoming what this moment required. Yes, she said, I'm ready. Walsh nodded. She picked up a pen and signed the bottom of the pipeline document. Ensign Chen, welcome to the program. 6 months later, the basic Coronado added a new module to its advanced marksmanship curriculum. The module covered extended-range precision engagement technique, atmospheric compensation at altitude, and the application of Henry Chen's 1987 trigger breath methodology to modern precision rifle systems. The module was developed and taught by Ensign Victoria Chen, United States Navy, the woman who had cleaned that range for 805 days, who had been invisible by design and visible by choice, who had waited without surrendering, who had held what was heavy without letting it break her, and who had proved on a morning when everything broke that the most dangerous person in the room is not the one with the most authority. It is the one who has been preparing the longest in silence for the moment no one saw coming. True capability is not granted by rank, and it does not announce itself. It waits and it works, and when the moment arrives, it does not miss.